All right.
Why don't we go ahead and get started?
Bev is trying to join in, Tom. She just texted me.
Who did?
Bev, she said my sound isn't coming in. I will get out and try to rejoin. So she may join us in a minute.
Okay. Looks like Jim Perry's coming on board here. Let's see if he got his video fixed. Let's start with a brief prayer. This is from those little Lenten devotionals that Georgetown sends out by email, and this is the prayer from this morning. It says, "Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia! You are risen, O gracious Lord. Send your Spirit so that we can love you, know you, and follow you every day more and more. Let us be glad and rejoice." So let us be glad and rejoice. It's a beautiful day for it, that's for sure. So I thought we'd start off with a little recap, a real brief recap of last week. Just we have a couple folks that weren't here last week, just to get everybody on the same page. But there's really two main ideas I think that came out of last week. One was the whole idea of globalization. The whole book is sort of based on the fact that we're in a new era of globalization where the world's becoming smaller and smaller. And that people in Pakistan are basically like our next door neighbors. You can get on one of these platforms like Zoom and talk to somebody across the world. We also talked about the promise and the perils of globalization. There's that article from the Washington Post talking about this very COVID-19 epidemic and how this is the very fast pace which it spread. Is one of the perils of globalization and the international travel. He then talks about the difference between what he calls a cosmic war and a religious war. What he calls a cosmic war, well, a religious war is where two different religions that don't get along get in a conflict and there's violence. A cosmic war is more of an us versus them, and more of a black and white. It's us versus evil. More than us versus them kind of thing. So it's a cosmic war. He describes as being one that goes on forever. It's never completely over, and you can never really win it because evil is always with us. And he talks about how the 9/11 terrorists use this verbiage, this cosmic war verbiage of fighting Satan and fighting evildoers, and the fact that they weren't really attacking the United States or Britain or any particular, or Presbyterians or Roman Catholics or whatever. They were attacking Satan. They were attacking what they felt was evil. And we responded, and we used all those quotes from last week from our president, George Bush, and then also a lot of leaders, where they used the same religious wordings in response to this. As we're fighting against Satan and we're fighting. So it was, Aslan's point was that we got sucked up into this cosmic war kind of thing, and it's just one of these things that nobody can win. So globalization is one big key from last week. The other is this whole idea of identity and how people identify themselves. And he talks historically about how that's changed over time, but he talks about as an effect of this globalization, that some people tend to identify themselves more with their religion than they do with their nationality, and so people feel more loyalty to their religion. Certainly, these radical jihadists certainly feel more loyalty, and they identify themselves as through their religion rather than through any kind of national affiliation. And they can cross borders. The borders don't mean anything because their identity is not with any particular nation. So that kind of catches us up on next week. There's a lot more in last week, but those are the two main points that as we move forward, globalization and identity. So he starts off chapter 2 with almost kind of a personal travel log. And I sent those, I've never been to Israel or to Jerusalem. And so I sent out those videos yesterday because I kind of tooled around on YouTube and found those brief descriptions of the Wailing Wall and the Temple Mount. And I thought they were very interesting. But I thought, is there anybody here that's actually been there and could describe them sort of firsthand for us, or
Nope.
no?
Jody went,
I
but
know Jody's been.
you saw
Yeah.
them.
The videos were great though.
Yeah, they were.
They were. One was, I think, one was the Smithsonian. And I can't remember what the other one was. A BBC, I think. But yeah, they were brief, but they gave a little historical context. The longer one kind of went into more. It kind of talked more about. It talked about Jerusalem a little bit, but then it went into some of the other sites in Israel. But at any rate, something to look at on Saturday when we're stuck in our house. But you know, the point he makes here is that you know, the temple. Or let me go back. He talks about visiting the Wailing Wall. I've heard about the Wailing Wall, and I never really knew what the Wailing Wall was. It turns out it's the remnant. It's really the only remnant of the temple that was built by Herod the Great before the birth of Christ, and it was a mammoth building. From that video, you know, you can tell how enormous this thing was. He also built ports. He built all kinds of theaters. He apparently he was a builder. And but at any rate, so this western wall of Herod's temple is all that's left of that temple, and that's the Wailing Wall. And that from that video, you can see just how enormous it is. A big courtyard around it. The people, the Jews, you know, make pilgrimages there, and they leave prayers in the little crevices in the wall and that sort of thing. Aslan makes the point that it's a religious shrine. It's a religious site. It's what's left of. You know, it's built on the site of Solomon's temple, which was destroyed in whatever 5 something BC, and then what's left of the second temple, which was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So it's a religious site. They visit, they leave prayers. It's they worship. But he also makes a point that it's a political statement. That it's you know, that it's the Jews are here and they're back and they're not going anywhere, and that this Wailing Wall, you know, is in an area that's shared by the 3 monotheistic religions, but it's not only a religious site, but it's a political site as well. And he contrasts that with the Temple Mount, which is the highest point of that area, which is actually Mount Moriah, and it's the mount where Abraham in the Jewish tradition was going to sacrifice Isaac, and in the Islamic tradition where Abraham was going to sacrifice Ishmael. But that's where the temple was built. It's apparently a big open space, but there's one mosque there, what's it called? The Haram al-Sharif. It's the Dome of the Rock, and it's the stone where apparently Muhammad was standing before he ascended into heaven. Muhammad ascended into heaven as well. If you're Islamist, you believe that he ascended into heaven, much like Jesus did. So they have their holy shrine at the top, and it's actually controlled by a trust, an Islamic trust, that's not even in Palestine. It's in Jordan, or I think it's Jordan, or maybe Syria. I can't remember. But anyway, it's not controlled. It's controlled by Muslims. And so here you have this holy of holy sites, and basically in the same place as this Jewish site. And there's Aslan describes his attempt to get there, and the Israelis hassled him because he had a backpack, and they wouldn't let him up because he was Muslim. And so he went back down and went around. There's apparently several different ways to approach this Temple Mount. And he went through the Muslim checkpoints and was able to get and visit this place. But again, he makes the point: it's a very sacred site. It's one of the most sacred sites, you know, after Mecca, and for Muslims. And he makes the point that it's not only is it a very holy and religious site for these people, but again, it's a political statement. We were here before the Zionists got here, and we're going to talk about the history of that in a minute. And we're not going anywhere. And it's a territorial, political statement, as well as a religious shrine. And if you go back to chapter 1, at the end of that chapter, Aslan makes the point that with these cosmic wars, these wars of people identifying themselves as in the right and God is on our side and everybody else is evil and represents Satan and evildoers, that he needs these conflicts. There's usually a political or an economic or some other factors that play into this, and that we need to separate the religious rhetoric from the political. And then then this next chapter he goes in there. We have these two shrines that are basically adjacent to each other, that are sacred sites where worship happens, where prayers happen for both of these groups, but they're also political statements. So here we have this intermingling of politics and religion again, if you will. And this really becomes important. I was kind of reading this and saying, well, and then he leaves this, and he kind of goes on to talk about Zionism. I said, well, what was the point of that? And the point of that is at the end of this, when we get to the end of this chapter, we're going to come back to these two sites and talk about that a little bit. So he talks about, so he ends that section by saying, so it goes for decades, for centuries. If a nation is a historical narrative written in the myths and memories of a united people and the state that narratives cover and binding, the cosmic war between Israel and Palestine is what happens when two competing national narratives, neither of which can be harnessed by the state, vie for the same sacred eternal space. So basically he's saying, we've got two different national identities and basically trying to exist in one spot. So he talks about the history of Zionism, and again, this is something I knew absolutely nothing about until I read this chapter, and then I read a little bit more about it, and it's really pretty fascinating. I did not understand the whole history of how Israel came about as a state, and you have to remember that this book is written by a Muslim, so we're reading sort of the other guy's point of view. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when you read this. And I'm sure if we read some Zionist history of the settlement of Israel, it would be somewhat different. But he talks about really it started the whole concept of a Israeli nation state started in the 1800s. And remember, we talked with the previous book about the rise of nationalism and with the Enlightenment, religious reasons for things kind of went by the wayside, and science and mathematics and reason took over, and at the same time, this system of national identity, that concept of how you identify yourself, was becoming more and more important in Europe. So French identified as French, and British identified as British, and that became more important than what your religious affiliation was. And at the same time, in the 1800s, as we had this rise of nationalism, this rise of identification with a particular nation, we really developed. That's where anti-Semitism really took a strong foothold. And his point was that the Jews that were in Europe, they retained their culture. They didn't assimilate. And if this resonates with what's going on in our country right now, I mean, think about that with the people that are coming from the Middle East into our country. But at any rate, so the Jews were not assimilating. They maintained their own culture. They very steadfastly held to their religion to the point where they saw themselves. They identified, using that word identity again. They identified with their religion more than they did with whatever country they happened to be living in. And this really kind of came to a head in the late 1800s, which was what's called the Dreyfus Affair. And I've heard of the Dreyfus Affair. I never really knew what it was. But it was in France in the 1894, actually in Paris. It was found that someone was leaking military secrets to the Germans. And I guess this was a time of turmoil, and at any rate, couldn't figure out who was doing this, and so very quickly the intelligence in France, they identified this guy Alfred Dreyfus, who was a sort of a low-level bureaucrat in the French government. They identified him as the culprit. The main reason they thought he was the culprit was the fact that he was Jewish, and that he was kind of the trial was kind of railroaded, and he was convicted and sent to Devil's Island, which was a horrible place to go to be in jail. And there was apparently a big production out of all this, and a lot of anti-Semitic writing stuff came out as a result of this. And there was a fellow that happened to be but let me stop on that for a minute. So many French nationalists, again, these people that really identified with their nationality, declared that Dreyfus's betrayal was the inexorable destiny of his race. It says the Jews were a nation within a nation, it was inconceivable that their loyalties would be to France. This is the kind of thing that was being written at that time. And this was not in Aslan's book, but it reminded me when I was a kid, and John F. Kennedy was running for president. He was a Roman Catholic, and there had never been a Roman Catholic president. And there was all this talk, and of course we were, as a Catholic family, we lived in the shadow of a Baptist church, and all of our neighbors were Baptists or Methodists, and we were the only Catholics on the block. So we were very, very conscious of being Catholic in this sort of Protestant neighborhood. But there was a lot of talk that, would a Catholic president, if push come to shove, would his loyalty be to the Constitution of the United States, or would it be to the Pope as the final religious authority? And I even remember, and I had some, I couldn't find them yesterday, but they were circulating quarters. They were taking quarters with the George Washington on them. People were taking fingernail polish and painting red papal hats and red papal cloaks on George Washington on these quarters, because it looked just like Pope John the 23rd, who was the Pope at the time, who was kind of a obese kind of guy, a jolly old fella. But when you painted those things on George Washington, it looked just like Pope John the 23rd. So people were painting this on these quarters and circulating them to remind people that John Kennedy was Catholic, and that, where would his loyalties be? Much like this Dreyfus business. So I looked it up, and this is just for my own interest, but the first Roman Catholic nominee for president was actually somebody named Al Smith, who was a 4-time governor of the state of New York. He ran in 1928 as a Democrat and lost overwhelmingly to Herbert Hoover, who was the Republican candidate. And the main issue was the fact that he was Catholic, and that he would not be loyal to the country. He would be loyal to his religion. And there was not another Roman Catholic nominee for national office until John Kennedy. And since John Kennedy, there has been the first Roman Catholic nominee for vice president was Geraldine Ferraro in the 1980s, who of course lost. And then the first Roman Catholic vice president, and I did not realize this, was Joe Biden. So here we may have our second Roman Catholic president coming up. The only other Roman Catholic presidential nominee was John Kerry, and I was not aware that he was Roman Catholic either, which is kind of interesting because I guess it wasn't an issue. Or if it was an issue, it wasn't a big issue when John Kerry ran. I don't remember that ever coming up as an issue. I do remember in Virginia when the governor, who's now the senator, and I'm blocking on it, he was the vice presidential candidate with Hillary Clinton, but he's Roman Catholic. When he ran for governor of Virginia, there was a lot of debate about whether he would uphold the death penalty because it's a Catholic. He didn't say. I remember him coming out and saying, my duty is to uphold the law of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I will do that, and I will have to set aside my religious beliefs. So it's just kind of interesting. These same ideas from the 1800s, they're still here. They still play a role. But anyway, that was just a little aside. The other interesting point that Aslan makes is that when you construct this collective identity, whether that be a national identity, we identify as American, or we identify as Presbyterian, or whatever, that when you're doing that, and people are coming from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds, that one of the unifying factors is to have an other, with a capital O, an other, somebody that you can identify as against you, or an enemy, or a common opponent. And this becomes a theme as we talk about some of these other things through this chapter. But you can identify yourself. You say, "Oh yeah, I'm this because I don't agree with that. I'm not an other. I'm what I am." And that, whether that's your religion or whether that's your nationality or what have you. He goes on. He concludes that this Dreyfus affair, which was again 1894, really led to an exponential increase in this nationalism that developed, which really led in the 1930s, he says, to Nazism, and that whole nationalism and anti-Semitism really obviously came to a huge conclusion and horrible ending. But so getting back to the Dreyfus affair, there was a journalist from Vienna named Theodor Herzl, who was covering this whole Dreyfus affair. This is a big deal, and he was from Vienna and did this, and he was Jewish, and he was very much put off by all this anti-Semitic rhetoric that arose from this trial of the Dreyfus fellow. And he, started thinking on this and thinking, well, how is this ever going to work? The Jews have had hundreds of years to assimilate, and they just haven't, and it's probably not going to happen. We need our own state. And so that's sort of this guy, Thomas Herzl, along with a fellow named Nathan Birnbaum, who was a classmate of his and another educator, came up with this idea of a separate Jewish nation state. The two of them founded a national Zionist group called Kadima. I don't know if I said that right, Kadima, which is translated as moving forward, to try to present a sense of unity within the Jewish community. And again, and that the Birnbaum, the Thomas Birnbaum, is the fellow that's credited with creating the term Zionism. And a pop-up just came up that said, I only have 10 minutes left, so I guess they are going to enforce the 40-minute rule. So I'll see how much of this we can get through. If not, we'll just finish it next week. But Herzl went on to write a very influential document called Der Judenstaat, which is the Jewish state. It was published in 1896. It was 2 years after the Dreyfus conviction. And he proposed that the Jewish state be established in Palestine. That land didn't really have a central government at that time. The Muslims that lived there were under the Ottoman Caliph. Remember from the other book that the Caliph was sort of the person that took over as the head of the Islamic religion after Muhammad died, and there was a series of caliphs. And actually, after World War I, the position of caliph was done away with. But at any rate, this whole area was under that kind of jurisdiction. As we talked about, Jerusalem was sacred to the multiple religions. But again, they proposed that this Zionist ideal, the ideal of a Jewish nation state, could only be achieved if they did it in Palestine. The only problem was people already lived there. There was already Arab Muslims, there was already Arab Christians, and there was a lot of Jewish people already living in Palestine before all these people started to immigrate there. I'm going to skip over. There's a lot of this. It's in the book, but there was a lot of infighting between. There was factions within the Zionists and all these kind of things. The long and short of it is that more and more Jews started to emigrate to Palestine, and after World War II, the British, who were in control of the area at the time, were tired of dealing with it, and they were tired of fighting wars, and they were just tired of being involved overseas. And they handed the whole mess to the United Nations, which had just been created after World War II. So the United Nations in 1947, the other historical points that are important is that Ottoman Caliphate, the Muslim head, that was done away with in 1923, and there's not been a caliph since that time. There was also Arab nationalism in Palestine, and they started forming their own groups. But in 1947, UN passed what was called Resolution 181, which divided Palestine into two areas. They were divided into two separate and distinct states, each with its own ethnicity and religiously homogenous, I'm using in quotes, nation. The problem is that the land was disproportionately divided. This is according to Aslan. Again, if you read, this is, again, you have to remember this is a Muslim author that's writing this, but he writes that the land was disproportionately divided. 80% of the land was given to the Jewish state, 20% was given to the Muslim state, the Arab state, the good farmland and the good seaports, most of Jerusalem, all that stuff was given to Israel, and they really, basically, Arabs feel like they got the short end of the stick, and so immediately there was conflict. And Israel declared its own statehood on May 14th, 1948. Since that time, 60 years have passed. There have been 5 major wars between the two groups. And at present day, this book was written about 15 years ago, but at present day, Israel was seen as a prosperous and secure nation with a good economy and people doing fairly well. Palestine, on the other hand, half of the Arab Palestinians were living as refugees. There's actually ongoing civil wars between the factions of the Arab Palestinians. There's Hamas and Fatah, which are two different divisions. They don't get along. They can't agree on how the Palestinian state should exist. But basically, there's ongoing conflict, and it was set up with the inevitable result that there would be conflict. So then he drops this story. So he talks about the temple and the Temple of the Mount and the Wailing Wall, and then he kind of drops that, and then he talks about the Zionist movement, which I really went through really quickly. Read the book if you want the full details. But he ends this chapter talking about this fellow named Muhammad Sadiq Khan. And who is this guy? Well, he is a Pakistani Briton. His family was from Pakistan. He was born and raised in West Yorkshire part of London. By all accounts, normal kid growing up, teenager, not a radical, not even that religious. Participated in a Hajj as a young adult, which, as you remember from the other book, is part of the 5 pillars of Islam. You go visit the holy sites, and so he went to Mecca, and on the way back they stopped by Jerusalem, and he witnessed some interactions between Israeli military and these Arab Palestinians where it was violent, and they were put upon. And again, Muslim author, but he saw this and felt that the Muslims were being persecuted, and that basically radicalized him. He came back from that trip talking about radical Islam and jihadism. Aslan says on page 53, but in that fateful moment, his identity, remember that we've been talking about this all the way through the first 2 chapters, his identity was altered. He was no longer British. He was no longer Pakistani. His sense of self could not be contained by either nationalist designation. So in other words, he did not identify himself by the country he came from. He was simply a Muslim, a member of a fractured imaginary nation locked without borders, locked in an eternal cosmic war with a Jewish nation just as imaginary and just as fractured. And he, on page 54 of Aslan's book, and I won't read, I was going to read it, but in interest, I've only got a couple more minutes left. I'll leave that to you, where he left a suicide video. He then participated in the July 7th, 2005 bombings in London, which are called we talk about 9/11. The Brits talk about 7/7. They talk about the July 7th bombings. This is where this all hit home for them. But 50 innocent bystanders were killed in a bombing, including Muhammad Khan. And he left a suicide video where he talks about his radicalization and the persecution, his perceived persecution by not necessarily just the Jewish, but just by the other, by non-Muslims. Again, they have to identify an other, and the other for him was anybody that wasn't a Muslim. And so it's just really interesting. So all of this kind of comes together. This chapter, it seemed like 3 separate sections, but he starts off by talking about the 2 sites that are religiously very important to the 2 different religions, but that are also political statements. We're here, we're not going anywhere. And you can beat us, you can run us off with tear gas, but we're coming back. And then he talks about the Zionist movement and this identification with religion rather than with your nationality. And then he shows how that radicalized this one young man in Britain, who then commits a terrible terrorist atrocity. He then goes on to talk about jihadism, and we talked about jihad in the last book and a little bit last week about how the term jihad just means struggle. It doesn't necessarily have any political thing with it. And Muhammad himself actually talked about the 2 different types of jihad. One is where you struggle with your own self about how you are to follow God's will, and the other jihad is where if someone attacks Islam, then you have to attack back. But this jihadism, with a capital J, this movement, is really what we see with the terrorists from 9/11, with this July 7th bombings in London. And it's a transnational social movement. The first chapter was called "The Borderless Self." This nation, if you will, this identity group has no borders. It's everywhere. As the challenge to jihadism is just like what the Zionists faced. They have to unite all these disparate groups that identify as, well, I'm Pakistani, I'm Saudi Arabian, I'm wherever, but to unite all these different races, cultures, ethnicities, and nationalities under a single collective identity. And how do you do that? And you do that with what he calls injustice framing. You identify a situation as unjust, which this Muhammad Khan, when he visited the holy sites in Jerusalem, he identified a situation as unjust. You assign blame, which, you know, creation of the other. It's creation of an enemy. It's not me, it's them. They're against us. And then you propose a solution, which unfortunately, a lot of times, a lot of these feelings are angry feelings, and that solution and that action turns into violence. And so you have this collective identity, which then